So yes, I'm going to talk about nature-based adaptation pathways in mountain social ecological systems as part of the Portal project, Pathways of Transformation in the Alps, that has been funded by the MOPCA program. And let me just start taking you briefly to a trip to the mountains, because it's part of the history I share with them and why I started to research on mountain social ecological systems. Here it's me skiing on a glacier a few years ago in the Alps on the Alps glacier, which is the largest glacier in the Alps, but which is dramatically losing volume and its size because of climate change. And I will show you how you can visualize that. This is the Concordia Hat in the glacier, or better said, this was the Concordia Hat in 1877, because back then you could reach the hat walking from the glacier. But in the last decades, as a result of climate change, the glacier has been receding, and a stair had to be built to climb the rock to get to the glacier. And this stair had to be enlarged and enlarged in the subsequent years to be able to reach the hat. So this is just one place in the mountains where you can very directly experience climate change. And because of this, I have been trying to focus more my research on mountains, because I think they are a great example on how climate change is impacting ecosystems and can show probably before than other ecosystems what can happen in other parts of the planet. Like, for example, we can see with corals as well. And a large part of my research focuses on ecosystem services or nature contributions to people, which, as you know, are the benefits from nature we depend on, and they range from clean drinking water to pollination or nature tourism. And just to put you an example why ecosystem services are important, especially for those of you who are not familiar with the term, I have brought here this example from the literature on ecosystem services, which shows the economic benefits you would get from a mangrove forest if you would leave it without any exploitation, or just a small exploitation. Sorry, you would get like forestry products that you could harvest sustainably, in comparison to the red bar, which is the economic value you will get in return if you establish a shrimp farm there. So actually, it could seem that exploiting nature is much more profitable. And that's the way it is often in our current economic system. But if you consider all these ecosystem services that I was mentioning before, like, for example, the nursery that forests provide to different species, or even the coastal protection against the storms and floods that is provided by the forest, then you will see that the value of the forest that is not exploited is actually larger than the shrimp farm that you could establish there. And if you remove economic subsidies that are often given to different economic activities, and even remove pollution cost and the cost of restoration, then the picture is very different. So this example from a tropical mangrove forest shows the need to consider all these ecosystem services into decision making. And that's what I have been trying to do in my research. So to go back to mountains, I did this systematic literature review on how climate change is impacting ecosystem services that mountain areas provide. And here you can see the number of publications that I found in different countries. And this basically shows the dominance of the Himalayas and Europe and the Andes, and this type of research, and the scarcity of studies in Africa. But just to put you some examples for those of you who are not so familiar with mountains, climate change is impacting water resources in mountains. In the long term, it will decrease the quantity of water in the summer period because of the melting of glaciers. And it's also impacting agriculture and farming in different ways. It is also impacting the regulation of extreme events, for example, with more extreme precipitation events, there is larger floods. There is also glacier lake outburst floods that are happening. There is, because of permafrost degradation, there is increased rockfall. And there is also in different parts of the planet, more vector-borne diseases, like for example, malaria or dengue, that are being recorded at higher altitudes because of climate change. And then finally, among cultural ecosystem services, there is a change in aesthetics. There is a change in the spiritual value and the attachment that local communities have to their glaciers. And there is changes in recreation and about the security in mountains. But of course, climate change is not happening as the only crisis, or as it has been put, as the only emergency that we are facing in the planet. There is also the biodiversity crisis, and both are highly interconnected. And it was interesting for me to find out a few years ago when we performed a systematic literature review on ecosystem services in mountain environments. And there you can see the bar of nature contributions to people, which is what we studied in a review, in comparison to the other elements of the IPBES conceptual framework, which are nature, good quality of life, drivers of change, and institutions. So what you can see here is that in the literature or in the scientific articles that have been published, people mostly study drivers of change with ecosystem services, as you can see, which is climate change, land use change, invasive species, and other direct drivers of change. However, I was surprised to find that there is much fewer research on institutional responses, and this refer to how we manage the climate emergency and the biodiversity crisis that we live with. And that was one of the drivers in my case to put together the proposal for the Make Our Planet Great Again program, to focus on solutions to the climate change and the biodiversity crisis that we live with. And that's why I brought this project on nature-based solutions, basically wondering if nature can be a significant part of the solution to climate change and biodiversity loss. So in the research project portal, we focus nature-based solutions, which are actions to protect, sustainably manage, and restore nature. And you can, for example, imagine the protection of a watershed to continue having clean drinking water for city downstream, or the management of agroforestry in an area with crops to increase the resilience of those crops to drought and to climate change. And you can, for example, think on ecosystem restoration to reduce the impacts of floods along rivers. So these are what we call nature-based solutions, which are increasingly being studied and applied as a solution, as a part of the solution to the climate change and the biodiversity crisis. So here, just to show one example in comparison with what's hard infrastructure, it has been shown that wetlands have the capacity to store water and release it slowly through the dry season in different parts of the world. So in many places, wetlands are being conserved and restored so that population downstream can have more water availability in the summer season. However, the evidence of the positive impacts of nature-based solutions is not so clear, and it's sometimes mixed. So you can see here in this graph for different challenges that we faced when managing ecosystems, how nature-based solutions normally provide positive outcomes. However, in relation to certain challenges, it's not so clear, like for example, in terms of water availability. And I can show you another sample here in which you can see, and this is the study of nature-based solutions as a way of reducing disasters and risks like floods or rockfall. And what you can see here is that for different ecosystem types, if you can look to the graph to your left, you can see that the level of agreement on how positive these nature-based solutions are to cope with disasters and risks is not so high. So the level of evidence is robust only for certain disciplines and ecosystems. So this is a knowledge gap, and there is increasing research on how useful are nature-based solutions to cope with different aspects of climate change and biodiversity loss. And in the Portal project, we approach this with an interdisciplinary lens that integrates, on the left, the biophysical system of biodiversity and ecosystem and ecological processes, and to the right, the social system, which benefits from all the ecosystem services that I was describing at the beginning, and which in turn impacts ecosystems through the drivers of change. So the box in the center, which is referring to institutions and governance, is what we are focusing in this project, particularly with nature-based solutions. And I just want to show briefly one example on why it's important to consider both the ecological and the social dimensions in relation to nature-based solutions, and it's in relation to the REDD+ program, which is the largest program to reduce deforestation and forest degradation in developing countries, and which in the last decades has been undergoing a transformation to further incorporate social aspects, for example, in terms of capacity building, but also aspects related to equity. So what we did in this research is, and if you are not familiar with the REDD+ program, basically what it does in its third phase is to provide direct payments to those countries that reduce deforestation and forest degradation. So previous research had already shown that it's possible to identify those areas in which we should conserve forest in order to increase carbon sequestration and to increase biodiversity conservation. But we didn't know what would happen if we incorporate equity as a constraint or as an element in the distribution of the funds of the program. So what we did is we applied an optimization model that allows us to compare the distribution of funds according to different criteria, particularly climate change mitigation, biodiversity conservation, and social equity. And in this sense, we try to assess the synergies and the trade-offs that different locations show in relation to the distribution of these funds. So what you can see here in this graph is how much carbon emissions can be reduced and how much biodiversity can be conserved in developing countries with the implementation of the REDD+ program, and how these benefits change when equity is further considered. So, for example, to the left, you can see a baseline scenario in which equity is not considered and in which we could reduce emissions by 20%. So we will have 80% of the total emissions currently. And you can see the number of species that would be lost in this scenario. And you can see how including equity slightly reduces the efficiency of the funds for conservation. But it's only slightly if you include equity to a small extent. If you include equity as the only constraint, there is larger losses. But for small inclusions of equity, and this is in the spirit of the UNFCCC, it's possible to achieve these three aims. And this can be seen especially in the maps that you have below that show which countries would receive the funds. If we target only climate change mitigation, you can see to the left, which is mostly countries where the cost of opportunity are very low and where there is forest rich in carbon. In the center, you can see biodiversity-rich countries that would receive the funds if we focus on biodiversity, like, for example, Madagascar or Colombia. And to the right, you can see a more egalitarian approach in which the three dimensions, equity, climate change mitigation, and biodiversity conservation, aim to be included. So going back to mountains and to the MOBCA project, we try to study nature-based solutions with a social ecological approach, as I was showing before. And we were using first the database of Panorama, which is a database from the IUCN that compiles nature-based solutions all over the planet that respond to climate change, but also other challenges like land degradation or biodiversity loss. And we studied all nature-based solutions that have been compiled by this platform, which at the time of study, there were 93. There is a few more now in mountains worldwide. And to give you just an overview of which type of nature-based solutions these are, you can think, for example, of this case in Tajikistan, which combined gray infrastructure and green infrastructure with a wall to reduce the impact of floods, and in which different communities participated on a voluntary basis to construct it. Or you can, for example, see this case in Peru, in which wetlands were restored together with ancient irrigation channels in order to increase the availability of water in the summer season. So what we did is we analyzed these cases, which, as you can see, they come mainly from upper middle and lower middle income countries. As you can see, Peru and India and Mexico are countries where there is a large number of nature-based solutions being implemented to respond to different challenges, like you can see land degradation, poverty, governance, or climate change. Those are like the broad challenges. And to the right, you have a diverse set of more specific challenges that nature-based solutions are responding to. So basically, this shows that nature-based solutions have a large multifunctionality because they can cover a broad spectrum of challenges that societies are facing in mountain systems. So what we did in this study is to cluster all these 93 projects into different categories. And what we saw is that 8 different clusters emerged to respond to these different challenges that I have been showing. Some clusters were focusing mostly on conserving biodiversity and reducing the landscape degradation. Others, like the cluster number B, were focusing more on local and indigenous people and biodiversity-friendly development, like, for example, with ecotourism. And finally, a third cluster was focusing more on climate adaptation and disaster risk reduction. So this is the framework which we use to analyze to what extent all these nature-based solutions were transforming the social ecological systems in which they were implemented. And I will guide you briefly through this framework. First, to the left, you can see the different challenges that were addressed by nature-based solutions, which are diverse, as you can see. And then below, we used what is called like the 3 spheres of transformation, which comes from the work of Karen O'Brien, which has studied how social ecological systems can be transformed to respond to change. And what's interesting is that in terms of values, there was different kinds of projects. Some were having a monistic approach to values, including either only intrinsic values, like, for example, the value of biodiversity, but others were including instrumental values, which refer to ecosystem services, whereas other projects were pluralistic, combining intrinsic and instrumental. So this was interesting to see because there has been some debate in the literature on which type of approach is more useful. when managing nature, if just including an intrinsic approach or an instrumental approach. And this kind of shows that there is different options and that both can work in different contexts. Then in terms of the political dimensions of transformation, what we found is that basically in all the projects, there was a very strong participation of different institutions, local communities, NGO, local administration, regional administration, but also universities. And that also capacity building and awareness raising were a significant part of those projects. And then finally, the third key component of these nature-based solutions were changes in how we manage nature, which happen in 87% of the cases, and that mostly included restoration actions, monitoring, and reducing pressure. So now I'm going to take you briefly back to the Alps, where we started the presentation. And this is the database of nature-based solutions that we have been compiling in the Portal project. And here, what you can see is 3 different types of nature-based solutions within the Alpine Convention space. And these include enabling activities, which are the projects that increase our knowledge in terms of climate change adaptation, or that refer to policy making in terms of climate change adaptation. Then we have on-ground activities, which are all the restoration and management projects to reduce climate change risks. And finally, mixed activities, which combine enabling components and on-the-ground components. So the first years of the project, we have been focusing on creating this database and spatializing it, which is a challenge because taking a record of restoration globally is a big challenge, and there is no formal institutions that do this. So we had to build this database, looking into very different data sets and contacting different institutions, and then making them explicit. But it has proven a useful exercise, I believe. And as I will show here with one of the results that we have, which shows that nature-based solutions are not strategically located to different climate change risks in the Alps. And you can see here to the left that they are usually located in areas which are facing higher temperature. But on the contrary, the nature-based solutions that aim to reduce the impacts of floods are usually located in areas where the risk of flood is lower. And you can see for each of the bars here, it refers to one individual nature-based solutions for each of the yellow bars. And the gray bar and the bar plot refers to the average for the Alpine Convention space. And then in contrast, for all the other elements that we studied, droughts, heat waves, changes in snow cover and fire, what we found is that there was no spatial pattern, and that nature-based solutions were located randomly in terms of risk. So this means not in areas of higher or lower risk. So basically what this, or we were arguing with this analysis, is that a regional strategy to reduce climate change risks in the Alps could be studied, so that nature-based solutions are prioritized in areas with higher risk. Also, when we compare the location of all these nature-based solutions in terms of ecosystem services supply and demand, what we found is that for water availability, grass, land production, rockfall, and recreation, all these nature-based solutions were located randomly, and that only for the demand for wood, the supply of climate change regulation, and the supply for biodiversity conservation, they showed a certain location pattern. Another of the things that we have seen with this database is that nature-based solutions can entail multiple trade-offs if not adequately designed and implemented. And this was important because when we review the literature, there is most of the cases a positive tone on the benefits and the synergies that nature-based solutions provide, which is certain, but there is also trade-offs that can emerge if they are not properly designed and implemented. So through a series of questionnaires that we performed, we evaluated the synergies and the trade-offs of these nature-based solutions in relation to different sustainable development goals. And as you can see here, for the 10 SDGs that we selected, we found trade-offs for 8 of them. And you can see the intensity of the trade-off with the color of the red in the scale. And you can see particularly that for SDG number 8, which refers to economic development, there is challenges and trade-offs that can emerge, but also, like, for example, for SDG 15 or SDG 9, so important trade-offs. And it's interesting to see that when we group the SDGs according to 3 topics, which are biosphere, economy, and society, what we see is that most of the trade-offs relate to SDGs that relate to the economy, and which somehow brings us back to one of the first slides that I was showing on ecosystem services and how this can be measured in monetary terms, and that without proper accounting of all the benefits that we get from nature, we will be finding outputs which are not always positive for humans and nature, like the transformation of a mangrove forest into a shrimp farm. So basically, what we conclude from this slide is that there is a need to change the economic system so that all these benefits that nature-based solutions provide, all these ecosystem services, are properly considered in decision making. Just to finish this part of the project that refers to the SDGs, what we provided is classification or a typology of different nature-based solutions in relation to different sectors like agriculture, forestry, natural ecosystems, and water provision and management. And you can see through all these 4 sectors how it's always the SDG number 9 that emerges as one of the SDGs that has more potential trade-offs. Another of the things that we have been doing within the Portal project is to participate in the Inter-Academy partnership statement on climate change and biodiversity, which are highly intertwined. And if you are interested, you can have a look in the website of the Inter-Academy partnership to read in more details how climate action and biodiversity can be managed simultaneously and can be properly governed, particularly with actions on the food system, on ecosystems, on energy, on rights and livelihoods, and on mitigation. And this relates also to one of the latest reports that has come out. It's a joint report from the IPBES and IPCC on biodiversity and climate change, and that speaks on all these interlinkages between these 2 elements and emphasize the need to tackle them simultaneously, which is also one of the things we were arguing for in a publication on how the post-2020 biodiversity targets that are to be approved later this year at the Conference of the Parties need to embrace not only biodiversity, but also climate change aspects. And now, to finish the presentation, I would like to show some of the ongoing work that we are doing. First, on risk management, you are probably familiar with this framework from the IPCC, which particularly focus on the hazards, the vulnerability, and the exposure components of risks. And this is what we are trying to see in a prioritizing exercise that we are doing now for the Alps, trying to identify which are the optimal locations to implement nature-based solutions. If we want to mitigate climate change in a climatic scenario, or if we want to reduce different risks, floods, heat waves, rockfall, fires, and drought, or if we want to enhance biodiversity. So this basically will show different locations in the Alps in which nature-based solutions can be implemented and which benefits could be obtained. And for example, we are looking for synergistic locations where we can at the same time increase biodiversity and reduce climate change risks, for example. So this is one of the axes we are working on. Another axe is focusing on adaptation pathways to the implementation and future scaling of nature-based solutions. And for those of you who are not familiar with the term, the scaling, it's basically the replication of nature-based solutions. And we have seen that this is very much needed to adapt to climate change. There is a big gap of climate change adaptation. And we are studying how different elements can facilitate this scaling of nature-based solution. And particularly, we are using the rules, knowledge, and values framework that has been published by Matthew Koloff and colleagues in different publications. And what it shows is that in environmental management, knowledge, values, and rules have a key importance. So what we're trying to do with a series of interviews to implementers of nature-based solutions through a series of workshops on participatory scenario planning is how knowledge, rules, and values interact within them in the process of the creation of nature-based solutions, and how this can be used to implement better and more effective nature-based solutions in the future to climate change. Then the third axe on which we are focusing now relates to transdisciplinarity, which, as you know, it refers to the combination of different knowledge types, particularly academic knowledge and the knowledge of decision makers, practitioners, and also local communities. And what we are trying to say is with the database that we have created for the portal project is if knowledge has been co-produced between academics and decision makers and practitioners. There is wide evidence that the co-production of knowledge can result in better outcomes for nature and for social ecological systems. So we aim to study with this framework that has been published by Albert Nordstrom and colleagues recently, to what extent knowledge is being co-produced in nature-based solutions using these 4 dimensions. It's context-based, pluralistic, goal-oriented, and interactive. So now we're in the process of conducting interviews to these nature-based solutions to assess to what extent the knowledge has been co-produced. And then the final 4th axe in which we are focusing now is in modeling the outcomes of all these nature-based solutions. And the way we're going to do this is to model the ecosystem services that they provide. For example, to see how these nature-based solutions can increase water availability, how they can reduce the impacts of floods or rockfall, how they can mitigate climate change, enhance recreation, or conserve biodiversity. And our aim is also to assess to what extent equity aspects can be included in this assessment. So, for example, how different population groups are benefited from these initiatives all over the Alps. And we can, for example, see this in terms of different income level regions or other variables that we are currently discussing. So this is my last slide. It's a screenshot from the website of the project. And it shows not all, but some of the nature-based solutions that we have in the database that we have uploaded to the website. And if you click in the different nature-based solutions, you can read about these projects. You can see a few pictures and learn about the history of these projects, what are their aims, where they have been implemented, which challenges they aim to target. And so we hope that with this effort, the community that it's interested in nature-based solutions can learn from other projects and try to replicate good practices in other parts of the Alps or in other ecosystems elsewhere. So yes, I don't want to finish without thanking everyone in the team, which is mostly around the University of Grenoble Alps, but also in other parts of France and Spain. And that's all. I'll be looking forward to take any questions you may have or to start a discussion. Thank you very much.
Okay, perfect. Thanks a lot, Ignacio. I'm sure there will be questions. There was a comment already by Nuno Jungana, inspiring, thank you. And I have to add my thank you as well. Maybe I ask the first question. Do you have an idea why the nature-based solutions are so misplaced? I mean, do you have, or not misplaced? I mean, maybe that's the wrong word, but why it's so random and why it's not better placed? Are there mechanisms behind that, or any ideas about that?
Great. Yeah, that's a great question. Thank you, Rainer. We don't know which are the main drivers that decide or influence the location of nature-based solutions, but we have certain hypotheses. One is that economic funds play a key role. So areas which have larger budgets for environmental management are more capable of restoring ecosystems or implementing certain measures to reduce climate change risks. Another is that knowledge can play an important role. So these nature-based solutions may have been implemented in areas in which knowledge on climate change impacts is higher. It's because the different institutions are more aware of the future impacts, so they tend to implement more nature-based solutions.
Could it also be that the land, I mean, I guess mostly it's land use, but you need to use some land, and that you just use what is available, and that is randomly distributed, or rather that only land that has poor value in other aspects can be made available for it?
Yes, that's an interesting comment. We have not checked that, but basically most of the solutions are implemented in natural ecosystems or semi-natural, like forests or riverbeds, and we get these ecosystems all over the Alps. So yes, I'm not sure if this is playing an important role or not, but it's something that we could try to assess as well.
Mm-hmm. Okay, I see that Camille has raised her hand. Please, Camille.
Yeah, I was wondering about this economic valuation, which you mentioned as being a real problem. You know, it's normally done very much just in terms of money spent. It's not, and money that you get back in, it doesn't include all of the services. But even so, ignoring that huge problem, I'm wondering if you looked at the financial cost of hard barriers, hard measures, infrastructure, compared to the cost of implementing a nature-based solution. Just that upfront, which is cheaper. I'm wondering.
Yes, that's a great question, Camille. This is not something we have done ourselves, but it's something other fellows have done.
Yeah.
And it seems to be that hard infrastructure is way more expensive than nature solutions. Then you can discuss how effective these are. For certain risks, it may be that you need a combination of both, because nature-based solutions may not be sufficient to mitigate the risk, and this serves for the higher cost of hard infrastructure. But yes,
yeah. I mean, that's my sense also, but I've not found a study that explicitly looks at that. But I was also intrigued by the example you gave of this sort of mix of, the hard infrastructure. I think it was Tajikistan, where they sort of built trees and whatnot along the waterway, but also, I mean, it wasn't a huge hard infrastructure. It's just some, big boulders that they put up. And it seems to me that maybe we should be exploring these combinations more, because if you have a nature-based solution, you may be able to get away with a much smaller infrastructure. Maybe you do need both, but if we can make the argument that nature-based, and as I said, I haven't seen the studies doing this, if you can show that hard infrastructure is more expensive than restoring a natural ecosystem, which I think probably it's the case, but then you find the natural ecosystem is not quite enough to deal with the increased flooding or whatever, it still may be good to include the nature-based solutions, sort of to get that infrastructure to be much smaller, less degrading of the environment, cheaper, So, I mean, to me, that's a really intriguing way to think about this, is combining those and making for me, the biodiversity impact of the hard infrastructure lower, because it's a much gentler, smaller intrusion into the environment.
Yes, totally. And with combining the hard and the nature infrastructure, you may get additional benefits in terms of all the cultural ecosystem services that you would get from the component or biodiversity, also regulating services in terms of, for example, reducing the pollution of the air, reducing the noise. So there is many benefits that you get. Another thing that is interesting is that there is a very large number of nature-based solutions being implemented in the global south. And I think this could be because of the lower cost of human labor in southern countries, because nature-based solutions, as they often require restoration, they require a lot of human labor. And this may be one of the reasons why there is a pattern towards the south.
Yeah, I agree. I tend to recommend school children. I say, isn't this a great school project? Get your kids out on the weekend, restore an ecosystem. Because that's the only way you can afford it in industrialized nations, because labor is very, very, very expensive. And yet all they're doing is planting things and taking weeds out. It's not, you don't need a trained labor, right?
Yeah.
And communities really get excited when you sort of say, no, you can go out and do this yourself. So.
Yes. I always recommended at my department that we should participate on some kind of restoration project besides the actions we do to mitigate our actions as scholars. But yes, I think this is something that we still have to integrate further.
Yeah. That's the transformational change.
Maybe to pick up on this. So everyone, if you would like to ask questions, as posted on the chat, just raise your hand, type it in the chat or in the question and answer tool. Yeah, maybe I have another one just picking up on that. So how is the communication going with both the general public, but also policy, etc.?
Well, we have done this part of the inter-academic partnership statement that was released before the conference of the parties in last year, the COP26. And that was more at the global level. Specifically for the Alps, we have not developed much yet. Our strategy is right now to continue compiling scientific evidence on these nature-based solutions, how they are implemented, in which places, how they are developed, and then provide a policy brief more towards the end of the project, in which we could communicate all the results that we have found within the project. So yes, I don't know if this is the standard way for MOPCA projects, but this is more or less how we have envisioning. We have provided some conferences, so I have been contacted by the Ministry of the Environment in France to provide one talk on nature-based solutions. And we, of course, are always open to these kind of interventions to share the results that we have. But then in terms of like a policy brief or a similar project or output, we are more waiting towards the end of the project. Yeah.
Other questions? Then maybe I have another one. So if I get one of the points you had was that, okay, the water budget of the Alps and the regions around is, so to say, in danger. Are you doing what? Is there a need for watershed modeling, and that you would also set up further basins, etc., to like pick up for where the glaciers are leaving?
Sorry, do you mean modeling on water balances or?
Yeah. I mean, are people doing that? That they calculate, okay, we normally have this and this water coming from the glaciers. This is what will happen. They will go away, so we'll have less water. How can we actually counter that?
Yes, of course, and particularly at the Institute of Geosciences of the Environment here in Grenoble, there is several colleagues who focus on that, on trying to assess how water flows are changing, how much water is coming from the glacier and how much water is coming from precipitation or from snow melt, and how is this going to change with climate change. So this you can read for different parts of the world, that in general flows of water are going to decrease in the dry season. In some places water flows are increasing now because of the meltwater from glaciers, so we have more water than we had before, but this is only temporal. This is going to last a few decades, and once the glaciers are more reduced, then we will start having less and less water. And there is several publications all over the world that show the several millions of inhabitants in different parts of the world, like for example in the plains of India and Bangladesh, that are going to be highly impacted because of these changes. And so it's important that we focus on what we can do to adapt to those.